May 3rd is the day when the spotlight goes on journalists and media freedom around the world. And the reality is, journalists in many countries find it increasingly difficult to do their job, and the Pacific is no exception. Don Wiseman has more.
Disinformation is infecting our media and digital landscapes, fueling hate and division. And as climate change batters our fragile planet, the lives and livelihoods of future generations are under the gravest threat this world has ever known. This year, World Press Freedom Day centers on journalism in the face of the environmental crisis. I honor the journalists around the world who are working to hold polluters accountable for the damage and the devastation.
That's the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, who says when he thinks of the values of journalism, he thinks of trust, truth and integrity. The BBC says journalists are facing increasing pressure, including state interference, harassment and criminal charges, which are used to undermine their work. In the Pacific, it can also be difficult. The global civil society alliance Civicus has raised concerns about Papua New Guinea's failure to set up a human rights body, and moves that it says stifle the media and freedom of expression. Here's their researcher, Joseph Benedict.
We have serious concerns about the state of freedom of expression. We have documented reports of, restrictions, harassment against the media and journalists, and the lack of protection for them. We are concerned about the ability of groups to organize protests and to hold them. There are still restrictions in the law.
The president of the Pacific Islands News Association says the role of journalism in addressing issues such as the environmental crisis is more critical than ever. Cora No says journalists serve as watchdogs, storytellers and advocates, but they're facing a crisis of their own. But he says threats to press freedom, censorship, harassment and attacks on media independence undermine their ability to fulfil their vital role in society. RNZ Pacific's PNG correspondent Scott Whitey says one of the biggest problems there is the loss of experienced journalists.
It's a struggle. There are two aspects to this. One is that younger journalists with very limited real-world experience are being forced into the management positions to fill in the void that's being left by seasoned journalists. And that is very risky for the industry because when they face intimidation, there's nobody to fall back on to get the guidance on how to deal with this kind of intimidation. So many just capitulate to this intimidation that happens. The other problem that I am seeing is that the lack of context, because as a journalist, when you're working in the media, the knowledge is gained incrementally over time. So that context is there if you spend considerable time in the media. But without that context and without that proper mentoring and without that backup, then it leaves the media very exposed to influences.
In Samoa, veteran journalist or Tangawhaya Tipi or Tangawhaya says in the past year, the government has made it very difficult for reporters.
Lack of access and transparency. So I can understand, if I'm going to put myself in their seats, it's not easy to face the media, but that's the role of the media in any democratic country.
Samantha Magic is in Fiji with Islands Business and says a key feature there is that journalists are now working in a much more free environment since the Bainimarama years, and many are still learning to readjust.
There's a lot of rebuilding that has to happen. I think, perhaps in some quarters there's this expectation that suddenly things are going to be a lot more robust, and the reality is that there's been a couple of sort of generations of reporters who've operated in a certain context, and really we need to sort of rebuild their skills and confidence, and also, that's true certainly of the media, but also of the sources that we go to.
She says in the wider Pacific, journalists are being held back by a lack of resourcing.
Journalists in the islands know what the stories are. They know that there's big stories that need to be told, but resourcing them to be able to go out to remote areas to really spend their time on investigative work is always a challenge. I think just keeping our bright young reporters in the profession is another challenge. So there's a lot of competition for people with skills to go into communications and other fields. That's not unique to the islands, obviously, but we need to find ways to incentivize bright young reporters to stay in the profession and really grow in the profession.
Kalafi Moala has been a journalist in Tonga for 30 years and says for Tonga, media freedom has emerged within that time span.
because there was persecution, often prosecution, and a lot of police search that took place in the newsrooms. Today, it's different. We haven't had in the last 10 to 15 years anything that's significant as we experienced before. I think the issue today is really that there's very little opposition concerning press freedom from, say, government or from those in power. It's an issue that's really up to the individual journalists and the media owners. Because to me, the big challenge in Tonga is that advertising money can become the issue that tries to dictate whether there is press freedom or not. In other words, to us right now, the challenge is to be able to be free irrespective of how it affects those that advertise on their newspaper or website, how it affects those that actually own the media.
The Reporters Without Borders Media Freedom Report for 2024 has New Zealand at 19, Samoa at 22, Fiji at 44, Tonga at 45, and PNG is up to 91.